This is what divorce was like in the time of Jesus, 2,000 years ago, judgment and punishment. The stone floor was cold beneath her feet. She stood in the center of the courtyard, surrounded by faces she had known her entire life. Neighbors, relatives, people who had celebrated at her wedding 7 years ago. Now they stared at her with a mixture of pity and disdain. Her husband held a small piece of papyrus in his hand, written in careful Aramaic script. With a few spoken words and that document, her entire world was about to collapse. She would leave this house with nothing but the clothes on her back, returning to her father's home, if he would even accept her. Her children? They belonged to him now. Her dowry? Already spent. Her reputation? Destroyed forever in a town where everyone knew everyone. What was divorce really like in first-century Judea? Why could a man divorce his wife for burning his dinner? But a woman had almost no legal recourse. How did the marriage contract, the ketubah, become a woman's only protection in a patriarchal society? And what was Jesus truly saying when he spoke about divorce in ways that shocked even his own disciples? Stay until the end, because what you discover about divorce in Jesus' time will completely transform how you read some of the most controversial passages in the New Testament. To understand divorce in Jesus' time, we must first understand marriage, and marriage in first-century Judea was nothing like our modern conception. This wasn't primarily about romance or personal fulfillment. Marriage was an economic contract, a social necessity, and a religious obligation all rolled into one. The average age for marriage was shockingly young by our standards. Girls were typically betrothed between 12 and 14 years old, while men married in their late teens or early 20s. These weren't casual unions, they were carefully negotiated transactions between families. The ketubah, or marriage contract, was the foundational document that governed the entire relationship. Written in Aramaic and signed by witnesses, this legal instrument specified the bride price the groom paid to the bride's family, the dowry the bride brought to the marriage, and most critically, the financial settlement the husband would owe if he divorced his wife or if she was widowed. A typical ketubah from this period might specify 200 denarii for a virgin bride or 100 denarii for a widow, substantial sums when a day laborer earned a single denarius per day. This wasn't a romantic document. It was a financial protection mechanism in a society where divorced women faced destitution. Life in first-century Judea was harsh, especially for women. The region was under Roman occupation, taxation was crushing, and most families lived at subsistence level. A woman's entire social identity was tied to her relationships with men, first her father, then her husband, then her sons. She couldn't own property independently in most cases, couldn't testify in court with the same weight as a man, and had limited economic opportunities outside the home. In this context, divorce wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was economic catastrophe. A divorced woman returned to her father's household if possible, but as an additional mouth to feed in an already strained economy. If her father was dead or unable to support her, her options were grim: remarriage, if possible, dependence on extended family, begging, or prostitution. The heat of Galilee in summer was relentless, reaching well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Women worked from before dawn until after sunset, grinding grain by hand with heavy stone mills, hauling water from distant wells in ceramic jars that weighed 40 pounds when full, weaving cloth on vertical looms while standing for hours, preparing every meal from scratch without any modern conveniences. A woman's hands were calloused and scarred from constant labor. Her back ached from bending over grinding stones. Her feet were tough from walking on rocky paths. This was the physical reality of being a wife and mother in first-century Judea. Unrelenting work with no days off, no labor-saving devices, no retirement. But this physical context makes the legal realities of divorce even more shocking, because in this world where women worked themselves to exhaustion serving their families, the law gave husbands extraordinary power to end the marriage with almost no constraints. And it's precisely here that we encounter one of the most contentious religious debates of Jesus' time, a debate that would force Jesus to take a stand that shocked everyone who heard it. But the legal framework was only the beginning of the story. The debate about divorce in first-century Judaism wasn't a simple matter of allowed or forbidden. It was a complex, heated controversy that divided the religious establishment into competing camps, each claiming to interpret Moses correctly. The foundational text was Deuteronomy 24:1, which stated, "If a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her, and sends her from his house." The question that consumed the rabbis wasn't whether divorce was permitted, that much was clear, but rather what constituted valid grounds. Two major schools of thought dominated the debate, named after their founders, the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai. These weren't just academic positions, they had real-world consequences for thousands of women throughout Judea and Galilee. The school of Shammai took a restrictive view. Divorce was only permitted in cases of sexual immorality, what they called ervat davar, literally a matter of nakedness or sexual misconduct. This interpretation offered women some protection, making divorce relatively difficult to obtain on frivolous grounds. The school of Hillel, however, interpreted the law far more broadly. They focused on the phrase, "becomes displeasing to him," and argued that this could include almost anything the husband found objectionable. Rabbi Hillel himself reportedly allowed divorce if a wife burned her husband's dinner. Later rabbis in his tradition went even further. Rabbi Akiva, teaching in the early 2nd century, said a man could divorce his wife if he simply found another woman more attractive. The Mishnah, compiled around 200 AD but reflecting earlier traditions, records these positions explicitly. The school of Shammai says, a man should not divorce his wife unless he has found her guilty of some unseemly conduct, but the school of Hillel says he may divorce her even if she merely spoiled his food. By Jesus' time, the school of Hillel's interpretation was becoming increasingly dominant among the common people, though the school of Shammai still had significant influence. This meant that in practice, a husband could divorce his wife for reasons we would consider absurdly trivial, speaking too loudly, going out with her hair uncovered, talking to other men in public, failing to produce children, or simply because the husband had grown tired of her. The rabbinical text Gittin in the Talmud preserves dozens of specific cases debated by the scholars. Could a man divorce his wife for bad breath? For being quarrelsome? For having a disagreeable mother? The mechanics of divorce were surprisingly simple, at least from the man's perspective. He needed to produce a get, a bill of divorce written in Aramaic according to specific legal formulas. The document had to include both parties' names, the date, the location, and a declaration that the woman was now free to remarry. It required 2 witnesses to sign. That was it. No court hearing, no investigation of causes, no consideration of the wife's perspective or the children's welfare. The husband summoned witnesses, handed his wife the document, and spoke the formula. Behold, you are permitted to any man. She was divorced. For the wife, the consequences were immediate and devastating. She had to leave the marital home, usually within 30 days. In an agrarian society where most people lived in small, tight-knit villages, there was nowhere to hide from shame. Everyone knew everyone. A divorced woman carried a social stigma that affected not just her, but her entire extended family. Her chances of remarriage were poor unless she was very young and childless. If she had young children, they remained with the father. Children belonged to the father's household, not the mother's. She might be permitted to visit them, but she had no legal custody rights whatsoever. The ketubah payment offered some financial protection, but in reality, this was often difficult to collect. If the husband could prove sexual immorality, he might not have to pay the settlement at all. If he claimed poverty, the payment might be delayed indefinitely. And even if she received the full amount, say 200 denarii, what then? That might sustain a frugal woman for a year at most. Then what? The economic vulnerability of divorced women was so severe that the prophet Malachi, writing centuries earlier, had declared, "I hate divorce, says the Lord God of Israel." Malachi 2:16. This wasn't abstract theology. It was recognition of the human suffering divorce caused in a patriarchal society. But there was an even deeper problem lurking beneath the legal technicalities. What about women who wanted to divorce their husbands? Under Jewish law as practiced in first-century Judea, a woman had almost no ability to initiate divorce. The verb used in Hebrew and Aramaic for divorce, to send away, was active for men and passive for women. A man divorced his wife, a wife was divorced by her husband. She was the object, not the subject, of the action. There were extremely limited exceptions. If a husband developed a repulsive disease, refused to consummate the marriage, or changed professions to something ritually unclean or socially unacceptable, like tanning, which involved constant contact with dead animal skins, a wife could petition the religious court to compel him to divorce her, but she couldn't divorce him herself. The best she could hope for was that the rabbinical court would pressure him to give her a get. If he refused, she remained married, unable to remarry, trapped in legal limbo. Cases are recorded in later rabbinic literature of women who remained chained to unwilling husbands for years, unable to move forward with their lives. The contrast with Roman law is striking and helps explain some of the cultural tensions in first-century Judea. Under Roman law, which governed the broader empire, women from citizen families had considerably more legal autonomy. A Roman woman could initiate divorce, own property in her own name, and maintain custody rights over her children in some circumstances. Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian, records that Salome, the sister of Herod the Great, divorced her husband according to Roman custom, a scandalous act that violated Jewish law and sparked enormous controversy. The Jewish legal scholar Philo of Alexandria, writing in the 1st century, explicitly criticized this Roman practice, arguing that it violated the natural order established by God. And it was precisely at this point that Jesus entered the debate. The Pharisees came to him with what they thought was a trap question. Matthew 19:3 records it. Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? Notice the phrasing, for any and every reason. They were asking Jesus to take sides in the Hillel and Shammai controversy. If he sided with Shammai, the restrictive view, he would alienate the majority who followed Hillel's more permissive interpretation. If he sided with Hillel, he might appear too lenient, contradicting his reputation for upholding righteousness. It seemed like a perfect trap. Jesus' response was revolutionary. He didn't choose between Hillel and Shammai. Instead, he went behind the entire debate to God's original design in creation. Haven't you read, he replied, that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. Matthew 19:4-6. Notice what Jesus did here. He bypassed Moses' regulation in Deuteronomy entirely and appealed to Genesis 1 and 2, to the creation narrative before the fall, before sin entered the world. He was arguing that divorce wasn't part of God's original design for humanity. It was a concession to human sinfulness, not a reflection of divine intention. The Pharisees immediately recognized the implications and pushed back. Why then did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? Matthew 19:7. Jesus' answer cuts to the heart of the issue. Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. But it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another woman, commits adultery. Matthew 19:8-9. This statement was shocking, so shocking that even his own disciples responded, if this is the situation between a husband and wife, it's better not to marry. Matthew 19:10. Think about what Jesus just did. In a society where divorce had become casual and routine under the school of Hillel's interpretation, where men divorced wives for burning dinner or speaking too loudly, Jesus declared that divorce for such trivial reasons wasn't just legally problematic, it was adultery. He wasn't simply siding with the more restrictive school of Shammai. He was going beyond even their position by connecting divorce to the creation order and by explicitly naming remarriage after illegitimate divorce as adultery. This wasn't just raising the bar, this was fundamentally redefining the entire discussion. But notice also what Jesus didn't do. He didn't eliminate Moses' provision for divorce entirely. He acknowledged the exception for sexual immorality. porneia in Greek, which likely corresponds to the ervat davar of the Shammai school. Jesus was realistic about the presence of sin and betrayal in a fallen world, but he was adamantly opposed to the casual, no-fault divorce culture that had developed under the dominant interpretation of his day. He was protecting the vulnerable, primarily women and children, who bore the heaviest consequences of easy divorce. The parallel account in Mark 10 adds a fascinating detail that's often overlooked. After Jesus discusses divorce, Mark records, "When they were in the house again, the disciples asked Jesus about this. He answered, 'Anyone who divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another man, she commits adultery.'" Mark 10:10-12. Notice that Jesus speaks of a woman divorcing her husband, something that wasn't legally possible under Jewish law, but was possible under Roman law. This suggests Jesus was addressing a mixed audience, aware of different legal systems, and asserting a universal principle that transcended cultural boundaries. Marriage is a sacred covenant that should not be casually broken by either party. The implications of Jesus' teaching would have been enormous for his first-century audience. For women, his words offered protection against arbitrary divorce. If the new Christian community took Jesus' teaching seriously, wives would no longer live in constant fear that their husbands might divorce them over burnt bread or imagined slights. For men, Jesus' teaching demanded a radical shift in perspective. Marriage wasn't primarily an economic contract that could be dissolved at will. It was a sacred covenant that reflected God's relationship with his people, permanent, faithful, and sacrificial. But there's an even deeper layer here that connects to Jesus' broader ministry. Throughout the Gospels, Jesus consistently sided with the vulnerable, the marginalized, and the powerless. And in first-century Jewish society, divorced women were among the most vulnerable. They faced economic destitution, social shame, and practical obstacles to survival. By restricting divorce, Jesus wasn't imposing burdensome rules. He was protecting those who had no other protection. He was saying that women weren't disposable commodities who could be discarded when they were no longer convenient. They were image bearers of God, worthy of dignity and covenant faithfulness. This principle extended to Jesus' treatment of specific divorced women he encountered. In John 4, Jesus speaks with the Samaritan woman at the well, a woman who had been married 5 times and was currently living with a man who wasn't her husband. Rather than condemning her, Jesus engaged her in the most profound theological conversation recorded in the Gospels, revealing himself to her as the Messiah. He saw past her complicated marital history to her spiritual thirst and treated her as a person worthy of truth and grace. Similarly, when the Pharisees brought a woman caught in adultery to Jesus, preparing to stone her according to the law, Jesus protected her life and offered her a new beginning. "Neither do I condemn you. Go now and leave your life of sin." John 8:11. The early Christian community took Jesus' teaching on divorce seriously, even when it created practical difficulties. Paul, writing to the church in Corinth around 55 AD, addresses divorce in the context of mixed marriages between believers and non-believers. He counsels believers to remain married to non-believing spouses if possible, but acknowledges that if the non-believer initiates divorce, the believing man or woman is not bound in such circumstances. 1 Corinthians 7:15. Paul is working out the implications of Jesus' teaching for new situations, maintaining the principle that marriage is sacred and permanent, while also recognizing the reality of life in a fallen world. The Christian stance on divorce stood in stark contrast to both the lax Jewish practice under the school of Hillel and certain aspects of Roman culture. The pagan philosopher Seneca, writing in the 1st century, complained about Roman women who measure their years by the number of their husbands. The satirist Juvenal mocked women who went through 8 husbands in 5 years. Against this cultural backdrop, the Christian insistence on marital permanence was countercultural and distinctive. It became one of the markers that distinguished Christian communities from their surrounding societies. Historical records from the 2nd and 3rd centuries show that this Christian teaching on marriage had practical effects. The apologist Tertullian writing around 200 AD, describes Christian marriages as characterized by mutual love, shared prayer, and permanent commitment. The Church Father Clement of Alexandria argues that Christian marriage should be a partnership of equals in spiritual matters, even if social structures remained patriarchal. Over time, the Christian emphasis on marital permanence and the dignity of women would gradually reshape Roman law itself, contributing to legal reforms that made divorce more difficult and protected women's rights within marriage. When we observe what divorce was like in Jesus' time, we realize that his teaching wasn't an arbitrary restriction or a burdensome rule. It was a radical act of protection for the vulnerable, a call back to God's original design, and a challenge to a culture that had made divorce cheap and easy at the expense of women and children. In a world where a woman could be divorced for burning dinner, where children were separated from their mothers without a second thought, where economic survival often depended on male protection, Jesus declared that marriage was sacred, and divorce was a tragedy to be avoided, except in the most serious circumstances. The same God who established marriage in the Garden of Eden, who described his relationship with Israel as a marriage covenant, who sent his Son to be the bridegroom of the church, this same God calls us to honor the marriage covenant with faithfulness, sacrifice, and perseverance. The challenges we face in marriage today are different from those faced by first-century couples, but the principle remains. Marriage is designed to be permanent, reflecting God's faithful love for his people. This doesn't mean the church has no compassion for those who have experienced divorce. Jesus' ministry was characterized by grace toward those whose lives had been broken by sin and failure. But that grace doesn't erase the ideal. It points us back to it while offering forgiveness and new beginnings for those who have fallen short. The church is called to uphold God's design for marriage while also ministering to the divorced, the remarried, those trapped in abusive marriages, and all who struggle with the brokenness that sin has brought into human relationships. If this documentary has deepened your understanding of Jesus' teaching on marriage and divorce, I encourage you to share it with others who might benefit from this historical context. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts or questions about this topic. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel and click the notification bell so you don't miss future documentaries exploring the historical context of biblical events and teachings. Understanding the cultural context of Jesus' time doesn't just satisfy our curiosity, it transforms how we read Scripture and apply it to our lives. When we know that Jesus was speaking into a context of casual divorce that devastated women and children, his words take on new urgency and relevance. When we understand that he was protecting the vulnerable while calling everyone to a higher standard of covenant faithfulness, we see his teaching not as restrictive, but as liberating. Until the next video, and may God bless you.